and welcome to episode 98 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I'm John Denning in Los Angeles.
But John, you're not in Los Angeles for very long at this point.
I've got about 18 more hours, and then I'm out of here.
Which means that by the time most people hear this, you'll be on a plane.
Hopefully. Yeah, I'm notorious for missing flights, and tomorrow would be a really bad one to miss.
Yes, I remember that company trip we all took to Vegas, and you didn't make it on time.
On time. I made it. 3 flights later.
I'm still chafed about that.
One of our buddies when we were in Vegas last month introduced me to this girl as, here's a guy who holds the world record for missing more flights than he's ever made. I was like, thanks, Scotty. It's accurate, but mean.
Yeah.
And then I missed 2 more flights out of Vegas.
And that's not something I would be bragging about.
I'm an open book.
That's the difference between you and I. To me, that's a sign of dishonor. And to you, you're like, look at me.
Yeah. It's whimsical and sort of bohemian. I go with the flow, man.
It's funny. Perspective means so much because I'm like, that's irresponsible and mildly irritating.
I've never missed an important, the company trip maybe, but I mean, I've never missed a class. I've never been late for a tutoring appointment. I've never missed an event. I was at UCLA last week on time.
Yes, and that's what tells me that you do it intentionally.
I usually get distracted by something more interesting than a plane.
More interesting than Vegas? I don't know who you are.
She was Australian. It wasn't my fault.
Well, since we're traveling, we've made a song choice that actually references those travels.
Yeah,
what is
more
it?
Interesting than my drink today. So let's start with the song. My favorite band of all time. Anyone who disagrees is wrong. It's a band called Led Zeppelin. The song is Ramble On.
You don't even know your favorite band
as I
name.
ramble
I
on.
love it.
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin off Led Zeppelin 2. Can't complain about that. That's an easy one to get behind.
Yeah. So I'm definitely going to be doing some rambling. I think it's 10 cities in 13 days or something.
Yeah, I think that's too much, but that's just me. Well, you have a good time. Stay safe.
Thank you. I'll do my best. What are you drinking?
What are you drinking?
No, you're the fun one today. You go first.
I am actually having a real drink, a mixed drink after returning from the cider beer land the last couple episodes. And this is something that I've been drinking a little bit more of recently. It is a cherry vodka soda. It's not that the vodka is cherry, it's just Tito's vodka and soda, but then you put grenadine in it, and it gives it a nice red color and has a nice sweetness to it. I've been drinking this a lot recently and happy about it.
There you go. I drink a lot of vodka sodas, but I don't know the grenadine. But I like it. It's colorful, a little fruity.
On your side?
Me, like I said, I'm pretty boring today. I've still got to pack and a million other things to do, so I'm just drinking coffee. Good old boring black coffee.
For once, you've gone on the low side of things, so I like it. And I'm on the high side.
I know. You started this by calling me irresponsible twice. Here I am drinking coffee.
Well, 18 hours before my trip, I'm pretty much close to being packed. I've got a few things left. I can imagine the state of your place is largely unpacked.
Entirely unpacked. Yeah, I think the suitcase still has a tag on it. In fact, I've gone nowhere productive yet, but that's what nighttime's for.
Well, get into it.
There you go.
It's definitely darkening up, so at this point, it's all on you. I'm in relaxation mode, so let's talk about the LSAT.
Let's do it, yeah. LSAT World first, as always, and not a whole lot to report here, although I am curious to hear your take on some more updated numbers in a second. First, though, just a couple test date bits of housekeeping. We just came out of the November LSAT. That was last week. There is one more group of November test takers. In fact, they will probably be taking the test as this comes out, and that's the makeup group who are testing Tuesday, November 23rd. Good luck. For those of you who get a chance to hear this before your makeup test, we're thinking of you, wishing you good luck, hoping, obviously, that this one goes better than the original attempt. One bit of news for that test, and for obviously people last week, once again, score release will come out for everyone at the same time. It's December 1st, 9 a.m. or so Eastern time. So if you're taking the makeup, they're going to turn you around very quickly, about 8 days. If you took the real thing, you'll get it that same day as well. So that's November. Yeah.
That's November.
Very nearly in our rear view. The
Yes.
next test, and really the next date to be aware of, is for the January 2022 exam. That's a test that begins on Saturday, January 15th, and the registration for it, once again as a reminder, is this December 3rd. So 2 days after the November scores come out was the deadline, the cutoff to get in there for January.
And that's the housekeeping on tests.
Mhm.
Let's talk about what's going on in this cycle and some of the numbers. And I'm not going to do a complete overview. Maybe we'll do that deeper into December once you have returned from your world travels. But let's just talk about where things stand right now. We talked about this maybe a month ago. And at this point, it looks like the cycle is starting to slow down a little bit in terms of the number of applicants. A month ago, the number of applicants was up 8.3%. Now the number of applicants is up 1.1%. So it is still up compared to last year, and we all know that last year was a tough cycle, but it has slowed down considerably. Whether it slows down to the point where there's fewer applicants than last year, can't see that. It's still relatively early in the cycle, but we're starting to get to the point now where it's getting harder and harder to make big changes. So right now, up 1.1%, that's not terrible if you're a current applicant. If you're a law school, you're probably a little bit less happy because a month ago you had an 8.3% increase. You were thinking we're going to have another bonanza. It's not looking quite as great at this point. Let's talk about the LSAT scores because obviously you've had a couple LSATs come out so far, and we're starting to get swings in the data at this point, at least just looking at what LSAC is publishing on a daily basis. What I did was I went back and I took a look at the current situation and then looked back over the last month to see some of the trends that were actually occurring here. And if you go back a month or so, the scores that you had that were sub 150, there was a real lack of those. There just weren't too, relatively speaking, there weren't a lot. It was down. Now it's starting to narrow. There are more of them, relatively speaking, than there were a month ago. There's still a deficit of scores under 140, and that's just relative to last year. It's down about 18%, but previously it was down even more, so there's an increasing number of those. You go into the 150 range, it's pretty stable. Right now, there's 10% more scores from 150 to 154. That's about what it was a month ago. So that's trending the way that it is. Notice that's a slight score bubble at that 150 range. And last year was already a score bubble of sorts, so it makes you wonder. But that score bubble was much more in the upper tiers. When you go to the 155, 160, 165 bands, so really about 155 up to 169, what you're seeing is the bubble or the numbers are decreasing as we go forward. The 155 to 159 range is still up about 7%. But the 160 to 164 and 165 to 169, they're both down compared to last year. They're not down hugely, just 2.9% and 4.4%, but they are down. And sometimes people think, yes, that's fantastic news. It is in terms of your competitiveness. What you want last year to have had more high scores and this year to have fewer high scores if you're an applicant. But remember, last year was its own bubble. So this is being compared to the top of the bubble. It's coming down from what was already a peak. So it doesn't mean it's normal again. And the same thing happens in the 170 to 180 range. The number of scores from a percentage standpoint, 170 to 174 is down 6.9%. 175 to 180 is down 19.3%. And those sound like huge drops. But last year was so high, it was almost inevitable there was going to be a drop. This isn't that big of a drop, relatively speaking. So it is down from before, but it is still a bubble at this point. And these numbers have been relatively stable over the last few weeks. They're actually a little bit weaker than they were 2 weeks ago. Like 175 to 180 was down like 22%, then 20%. Now it's 19%. So it's actually decreasing overall.
Yeah. To me, this is all about frame of reference. And you can do this with statistics in just about every instance. Based on points of comparison, it all depends on what you want your baseline to be. Compared to last year, that high score bubble does seem to be deflating slightly. But we were in such an enormous bubble last year that compared to any years prior, we still are in one. It might not be quite as extreme. It might be leveling out more towards the middle. But to think that we're back to normal here, if normal is pre-2020, is not the case.
Yeah, if you use a 0 to 10 scale and you say 0 is the easiest cycle ever, everybody gets in. 10 is the worst cycle, it's ultra competitive. 2 years ago, let's say you had a 5, right in the middle, normal. Last year, you had a 10. Now you have an 8 or 9.
Right.
That's what the data is showing us in terms of like the T14, T25 type of schools. It's still worse than 2 years ago, but it is a little bit better than it was last year. We'll see how that continues to develop. But you're exactly right. Depends on what your frame of reference is. Compared to last year, it's an improvement. Compared to 2 years ago, still worse.
Yeah. Well, I can't say it any better than that. So nicely done.
Cheers.
Don't cheers me when I'm drinking coffee. How dare you?
Have a nice sip of espresso.
There's one more thing in the LSAT world, and then we'll get to the meat of today, which is that we've got some free webinars coming up. And we've made a habit out of mentioning these each time because I inevitably hear after every one somebody who missed it, somebody who's, again, regrets not having known or got the wrong date or something. So I want to be really clear that these are coming up and what they are. The most, I guess the one coming first, the most recent one is going to be an LSAT 101. It's a great overview of the test. Really important if you're just getting started or still in the building fundamentals stage of this. And that's being taught by one of our favorite instructors, actually, this girl, Kelsey, who's fantastic. And that is on December 5th. So it'll be the evening of December 5th. And then we go about a month until the next one. And this is the one I know you and I are probably most excited for because we're doing it. It's a crystal ball for the January and hopefully February test, with luck, maybe March. And this is going to be on January 4th, the evening of. So welcoming people into the new year with a crystal ball prediction. Those are always fun. And then the very next day, we kind of bumped this one for our own purposes. There is one on basic conditional reasoning, which is an incredibly important idea. That's going to be January 5th with another one of our absolute favorite instructors, a guy named Jay, who lives out here kind of near me.
Yeah, and Jay will actually be joining us for the crystal ball.
I'm not sure if it's Jay or Adam, but we're definitely going to have a third person there helping out.
Either one is fantastic, so we can't go wrong with that. I thought it was Jay, but it doesn't.
You're probably right as usual, but
yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
But anyway,
yeah, these are all. In fact, it's funny that this is the roster of instructors. Even Adam, who may or may not be there. All of these are people that we've been lucky enough to take on company trips over the years. We've had drinks and traveled and toured around with these guys, whether Vegas or Napa. So a great group of folks, and we can attest to that personally.
Yeah, we don't take every one of our instructors on the company trips because that would break the bank. But we do rotate instructors around on the trips that we've taken. We had to take a break during the pandemic, which is kind of like if you're thinking about becoming an LSAT instructor, it's a little power score perk for you because we end up going to fun places, whether it's San Francisco or Vegas or New York. I think those are the last 3 trips that we took. Mm-hmm. We don't do them every year, so it's kind of a special event, but we make sure everybody has a lot of fun. So just a little bonus of working here. Keep it fun. Because we like to party and have a good time.
One of many. And yeah, those things always turn into an absolute shambles in the best way. I love it.
Yeah,
I miss doing one. Once the world opens up, I can't wait to get another one of those in the books. So
yes, and it will be coming, hopefully.
Oh, I know it.
Probably Chicago and that general area. We'll have to see how it works out.
I might cast a vote for Austin, Texas, but we can get into that later.
We've got employee number 1 is up in the upper Midwest. We got to probably it's like having a home game for one of your seniors, something that Duke always does. We might have to show up in his town.
Take the party to him. Fair enough.
Yeah, especially since he's got 2 kids.
Yeah.
So that said, let's get into the discussion for tonight, which we knew Jon was leaving. We wanted to kind of talk about some law school things that are floating around. We've seen a bunch of questions recently, and so we're going to do a classic mailbag episode and touch on a number of different topics. We're talking about things like makeup tests, score preview, how LSATs are scaled, whether they mix and match experimental and real content. We'll talk about using the January LSAT to apply and whether or not you should apply now, and if the school will actually look at your application or whether you should wait until your score comes out in January. Just a whole bunch of different topics that are pretty relevant for almost everybody that's in the process right now, either with the LSAT or with law school. So let's talk about the very first one, and that is the makeup tests. Clearly, this will be coming out kind of in the middle of that, and we saw so many questions about this that we really wanted to address it just a little bit. And let's start with the most pressing question that we've been getting. Mm-hmm. How do makeup tests work? Are they the same as the regular test that was already given? And especially, I got a ton of questions about this. Are they harder? Or in some cases, easier or the same as others? But a lot of people ask me the question, is the makeup test harder? Because they are fearful of that being the case. So, John, let's talk about some of those things.
Yeah, we always try to attribute sourcing for these things, but frankly, I've gotten this question on just about every platform we participate in.
Me too.
So yeah, this was a global question to be sure. So first things first, the makeup test. Again, this is going to come out right in the middle of the day, so I don't feel like this is too prejudicial or revealing. They're offered the week after every regular LSAT date for people who've had any issues that may have prevented them from completing the exam as intended. These can be technical issues, proctor problems, whatever the case may be. But this happens every time. And again, we're seeing it this week a little earlier because of the holiday for Thanksgiving. First thing I can tell you is they will not contain the same content that was seen during the regular test week. And again, it pains me to say this, but it is true. They definitely will not be a repeat of the test you originally got, or just a continuation of where maybe you lost the ability to continue testing. This is going to be a brand new test that you get, something you have not seen yet.
Yeah, so let's stop there for a second.
Okay.
Because the first thing that you just said was like, they're not going to let you back into your original test. That is indeed the case. A lot of times people are very disappointed to hear that, and I understand their disappointment, especially if they were in the last section of the exam and things broke down. It's really frustrating to have to go back and redo 3 sections just to get through that 4th one. But they, for test security reasons, don't allow you back into a test once you're out of the system for more than, a minimal amount of time. So it's going to be a completely new test to you. And that means starting all over again and having to kind of it's really ground zero in that sense.
That's right. Yeah, and a completely new test, as I said, compared to what the people who were testing at the same time as you originally got. So if you heard, for instance, our November recap episode last week, we talked about the real games and the experimental games. We talked about what was actually included on the November test. You will not see any of that content on the makeup, which is why we were able to release the episode, frankly.
Yeah, it doesn't have any kind of prejudicial effect in terms of that. So, John, if you know that they're giving that test tomorrow, any thoughts on what test they might get?
Well, so what do they do instead? What they have always traditionally done, I see what you're baiting me for, and I'm going to take that bait. Don't you worry. I'm on it. But what they have typically done in past is they have dusted off some non-disclosed, which means it was never released, never available to the public, no one has a copy, some test from the vault, and they reuse that for the makeup. Usually this is in the form of a prior year's February test. Back in the days when there were only 4 LSATs a year, 3 were released, but February wasn't. They kept it for these types of reuses. And that's what they have more or less always done with these makeups. So, you asked me a question. I'm here for it. Do I have a guess as to which Februaries I think they'll use tomorrow? I do. It's an educated guess, not a certainty, but I'm still willing to put some money on it. If you want to bet against me.
On it?
5 euros. I always come back with.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll take it because, I want to go to Europe at some point here in the next few years, so I might need 5 euros.
Perfect. I got you covered. Unless I'm right, in which case go to the bank. Currency exchange.
In which case I will give you 5 Canadian dollars.
That's a terrible exchange rate I just got. That's worse than American. Fine.
You're not supposed to know that.
The satisfaction for me is that I do think I very likely could be right. These are my guesses, and I'm going to hedge a little with 2. I think February 2015 or February 2017. I think that's the test that'll get. One of those will be the test they use tomorrow.
I think it's a decent shot, and keep this in mind if you're listening. Us saying that is really meaningless. Those tests were given, but they were not disclosed. So nobody can go take the February 15 LSAT or the February 2017 LSAT. It's just out there as a piece of interesting information, but you can't actually go do the passages or the games or the LR from that. But again, we've said this before, we shouldn't be able to predict these types of things. And this isn't some kind of hugely formalized prediction, but we're probably fairly close on something like this.
Yeah,
now,
one of the many crystal ball. The long ones we do were a many crystal ball, like a teeny one. One line from a bigger
marble.
Yes.
This is a crystal marble.
It's a crystal PV. No, the one we did before November predicted the November test perfectly, spot on.
Yes.
This is just a kind of micro version of that.
I'm pleased that you mentioned that again because I would like to celebrate that fact probably for the next year.
I will never stop mentioning it.
Well, you shouldn't.
Until we do it for the next one and get right again.
Let's do that.
I'll update the resume.
Once you start beginning the winning streak of that, then you go down in the LSAT Legendary Hall of Fame kind of situation. But the biggest question that I got from people was, is this test going to be harder?
Right.
Because they're like, well, I already saw an LSAT, so they're just going to give me something harder. I'm more of a guinea pig now. That is not the case at all. As I tried to reassure the many people that I spoke to about this is just another LSAT. And so it's neither harder nor easier. You just don't know. It could be very similar. It's impossible to tell. Each LSAT has differences. If you've done more than one prep test, you already know that. That's exactly what this is. This is just like a deck of cards with different unreleased prep tests. They throw them out and, you get it. So for your situation, it's not something that you can expect to be easier or harder. You just go in and think it's another LSAT. If it is logically harder, the scale will be looser. If it is logically easier, the scale will be tighter. The one difference here is that when Jon and I look at the deck of cards that they're drawing from, we know how small it is. Most students aren't going to think about that. You don't need to think about it. Just go in and try to slam the exam. Do your very best. Don't think about the last one that you had and just focus on this one and don't think about the difficulty. Worry about it all afterwards. If you get a bad section, say to yourself it's experimental and keep on moving forward.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
like that analogy, actually. It just feels like you and I have been sitting at the table longer than anybody counting cards. So we have a better idea of what's next.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I don't think LSAC has been able to reshuffle the deck or the shoe during this process, but I get your analogy.
Yeah, good. And as I mentioned before, last thing about the makeup tests is that scores will be released. I've gotten this a lot too, at the same time as everyone else's scores. So again, the morning of December 1st, you will get your number.
There you go. Let's move on to the next topic, which is our friend score preview. And someone had asked me, they're like, I thought, you couldn't, they were getting score preview and cancellations of tests mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, no, you can cancel any test. They were like, I thought you only could cancel the first one. It's like, no, you can cancel any test. But score preview has some specific rules to it. So, Jon, let's talk about what it is exactly and how it actually works.
Sure. You want me to explain it or you want to go for it?
Oh, no, I want you to do the work since you're about to go on vacation.
It's true. All the heavy lifting before I shrug it off.
Yes.
Fair. So what Score Preview is, essentially, it's a fairly new program that LSAC has offered. If it's the first time you are ever taking the LSAT, you have the option of paying a little bit of additional money, $45 before you test, $75 in the week or so after you test, to get access to this thing called Score Preview. Again, it's for first-time test takers, first-time people who are seeing an LSAT officially for the first. So if you took it before and canceled, you're out. If you took it before and just gave up halfway through, you're out. But if it's your first time, you can do this. And what it allows you to do is when you get your score released with everyone else, so in the case of November on December 1st, you will see your result and still have the option to cancel it. So it's like a transparent cancel. Everyone else who has to cancel has to do it blindly in the 6 days after their exam. You can do it in the 6 days after you have your score. That's what Score Preview allows.
Yeah, and let's pull out one of the salient points there, which is you do not get your score early. Your score appears on the same day as everyone else's. And you said that, but that's worth repeating because one of the misconceptions about this is I get my score immediately or earlier, and then I have up until score release day to cancel. No. You get it on December 1st at 9 a.m. in this particular instance with everybody else. Now, those people who are getting their score who don't have Score Preview, that's their score. It goes on their permanent record.
Mm-hmm.
You, if you have Score Preview, then have 6 days to think about it. Now, let's say your score was delayed. Didn't come out on the 1st. You forgot to do the LSAT writing. It was your first time. You got pushed to December 4th or something like that. You then still have 6 days from the time you see your score to go ahead and cancel. So sometimes people are like, what if my score comes out after the 6 days? No. The 6 days starts when you see your score, when you get that message. Then you have the time to think about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point, because the name of it, score preview at a glance, does potentially imply that you get to see your score before others do. Not the case. You get to preview your score before you cancel it. That's what this is.
It's a bit of a misnomer in that particular sense.
A bit misleading, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like pre-final score. That's right. What's really happening.
Yeah, it's more like score confirmation or something. But anyway, that's how it works. And so that answers a lot of the questions that we've been getting about it. But it's not the entirety of the questions that we've been getting about it. There's a follow-up to this that I continue to see. Specifically, I got this a few times on Reddit, which is it worth it? Is it worth the money? When is it a good idea to use it? How might this actually benefit someone versus, are there people for whom score preview is not really, again, either worth it or advisable? So, I guess I'll continue. That was meant to be a question for you, but I'll take it. Ramble on. This is the way I feel about it. I do think it's worth the money if you have certain concerns, or at least there's at minimum 2 groups of people who I think could hugely benefit from score preview, whether it's the $45 paid up front or the $75 commitment after the fact. One of those would be a group of people who are concerned that maybe this first attempt might go poorly. They're feeling a little shaky or anxious going into it. Maybe there's a huge variance in their practice test scores where some are great and some are abysmal, at least in terms of their goals. And so what they'd want, obviously, is some sense of certainty before they have to make a blind decision about what is or is not going to go on their record. That's where score preview can be a big bonus.
Yeah.
And a second group of people that mystify me in a way. I've never gotten my head fully around this choice, but this would be a group of people who were maybe taking the test but planning to cancel anyway. So they were testing solely for the experience of taking a real thing. What's it like to deal with a proctor? What's it like to log in and go through this? I think that's generally a pretty terrible idea for a number of reasons. But if someone is a part of that group, it would make sense that they'd at least want the feedback of a number, that diagnostic data, even just a single number of it, before they commit to the cancellation that they knew was coming anyway.
Yeah, that second group is often like the cold test takers. Oh, hey, I'm just going to take the test. I haven't studied for it. My response to those people is always, don't take the test, don't waste the take, don't waste score preview, withdraw, come again for another day. You have committed a terrible sin in my mind by taking that approach. You have wasted one of your LSAT takes, and there is a limit on that, as we know, the 3, 5, 7 rule, right, over a year, 2 years, 5 years. So you just threw away one of those foolishly. And then secondly, the score preview is useful. We'll talk a little bit more about cancellation in just a few minutes, but one of the things is that sometimes you don't have the best day. And if you know you have a score that is going to go on your record that is substantially lower than, say, where you've been practicing, why should you take it? I've kind of become a little bit more militant about the use of cancellation in general, which I'll outline later. Yeah. And this kind of goes in line with that. If you've been doing practice tests and you're clearly in the 160s constantly and you're doing it over and over again, and then you take the test for the first time for real and score preview shows a 145, why are you keeping it? Yeah. You know you're retaking it. You know that 145 isn't representative. And of course, the argument, as we'll get into later, is that, well, only your high score matters. Yes, but you're a person, and having that 145 on the record for most people drives them crazy because they're like, that's not the score that I wanted. I know I'm better than that. And then they're thinking about the past instead of the future. So I'll end up saying this probably in more detail, but there are times where canceling a score is actually a very good choice. And score preview allows you to do it painlessly. Mm-hmm. You get to see what it would have been. You can kind of confirm, hey, this is within my range of what I think I should be getting, versus, hey, this is way out of the range. And if it's not in a good way, get rid of the score. I really like the option. I wish it was for every test taker.
I certainly do too. I also wish it was free, but while we're wishing. One of the things that just comes to mind now, I saw a couple of threads, I think, on Reddit where the question was posed, like, has anybody debated canceling a score and not, and it ended up being way better than you thought? And there was a whole series of affirmative comments to that. Be like, yeah, I honestly didn't think I broke 160. I got a 168. I thought I did way worse than my practice test, and I actually went up 2 points versus my last one in the rule. But Score Preview would allow you to know that too. So it's not all preventative or some kind of like, prophylactic. This is largely, I think, about the idea of just knowledge is useful before you have to make a permanent decision.
Yeah, it's more information. How can that be bad?
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes, again, you may surprise yourself and be like, good God, I'm glad I didn't cancel that. I'm glad I had a look because I'm keeping that for sure. I'm done with the LSAT. I hear that from people all the time.
Happily.
Yeah. That's the dream.
I'm sure the cancellation thing's going to come back around in a little bit, but let's move on to the next topic, which is about the scaling and the curve and the various ranges that we have out there. And I don't know why it was this time. We got a lot more questions about the prediction we made as it transmitted down through the scale into the 160s, into the 150s. And so a good example of the questions that we were seeing on both Twitter and Reddit was, just listen to your podcast about the November LSAT. Great job. Thank you. I appreciate that always. I was just curious how the curve would look around the 150 to 155 range. And then I was asked a number of times, what about 160? What would it take? And so we posted a variety of responses to that. And I think we've kind of collated them here. And one of the things that we do is we take a look at other scales that are similar. And in this particular instance, we have predicted a -9 scaling. And that means you can miss 9 questions to get a 170. And that's for the November 2021 LSAT. There are 2 recently released tests which have -9 scales. That would be Prep Test 90 and Prep Test 92. So you can go look at those and think, will it be similar to that? And if you run down and you take a look at those scales and you kind of like equate everything, what you end up with is to get a 165 on something like November means you can probably miss 14 or 15 questions. To get a 160, you can probably miss 21 or 22 questions. And again, this is give or take 1 or 2. To get a 155, you could miss 27 to 29 questions. And then to get a 150, probably around 35 questions that you could miss, anywhere from 34, I think, up to 36 or 37. So that's the number of questions you can miss to achieve those particular scores. And that's roughly built off that -9 at the top. If that was a lot tighter, then the misses throughout the rest of the scale, in some instances, might be a little bit tighter as well. It kind of depends on the scale itself. But that gives you a good sense of what is possible. I wouldn't use it as the rule of law. It's not a perfectly black and white prediction, but it is a rough area, rough estimate. And as you go down the scale, it gets much harder to predict mid-level difficulty. So that's actually something pretty useful, I think.
Yeah. Let me actually take us back a little further even. 90 and 92, obviously 2 recent tests, both flex structured, but I did a bit of a dive into some earlier years and found 2 tests that I think are fairly comparable to what we saw in November, and that is September 2019, I think that's PT 88, and then December 2017. September 2019 was -13 for 170. And if you're thinking like, I wish I could have gotten that test, remember that's -13 out of about 101 questions. Those were in the days where both logical reasonings were scored. Ditto December 17. So the numbers I give here are out of a larger set, which is why they're magnified a little bit. But converted to flex, what you start to see on these tests is September, despite having a looser scale at the top, has a tighter scale in the middle. You could miss 34 questions in September to get a 150. You could miss 35 in December to get a 150. And yet at a 170, September let you miss 13 and December only let you miss 12. So you miss 1 fewer up at the top and 1 more at the bottom in December. So this is how it works. Again, this is why we try to talk about these things in small ranges. It's possible you could only miss 33 for a 150 on this recent November test. It's possible you could miss up to maybe 35 or even 36.
Let me throw something in there that might help kind of like explain how this works. I think a lot of times people look at these scales and think that they're rigid, that if you've missed 9 questions for 170, then that scale is going to be looser at all score points than if you could miss 7 for 170. And then if you were to compare 2 scales, the -9 would be looser all the way through. That is not how it works. It's more like an accordion. where it kind of moves back and forth, and you might be really tight at the upper levels in the 170s, and then the scale might loosen dramatically through the 160s and the 150s. Or you could be really loose in the 170s and it could be very tight in the 160s and the 150s. It's not rigid, and that's why we can't perfectly predict the scales below 170, because that's where it gets harder for us to see the difficulty. We can see extreme difficulty much more easily when we're looking at these tests while they're happening. So don't think about it as like, well, if 170 is looser, automatically 160 is looser and 150 is looser. Hey, it's a good sign that they'll be looser, but it's not an ironclad law, and that's because of that accordion effect on the scales.
Yeah, I've seen people try to take 1 point and make it proportional for the entire range of 61 scores, and that simply does not work when you do this.
All right, I like that. Let's move on.
Cool. All right, I'll read this one. This is a question we get after every LSAT, frankly, so we might as well address it here, see if we can put something official to it. This came, I think I got this on Twitter, and the message said, I listened to the November Recap podcast, loved it, by the way. Thank you. And I have a question. Is it possible LSAC mixed real content with experimental? My memory's a little shaky, but I seem to recall the passage about wig history being in my RC section with Rakim the Rapper that was experimental. Wigs was real, Rakim the Rapper experimental. The question then is, within a single section, was there both real and experimental content intermixed? And
You want the answer?
I'd love to know what you think.
The answer is no.
In fact, I'd love to know what you know. So, the answer is
emphatically, profoundly no. I had this on a number of different instances, and I understand why it happens, but it's not something that they do. It would be virtually impossible for them to make that work from a test integrity standpoint. They'd have to do it for everybody. You know, you'd have to say that questions 12 through 15 for everybody is going to be experimental. They do this on some tests, so that portion of it's not possible. But without announcing that particular fact, which I think would be an egregious public service error, I think that's something that LSAC would be bound to disclose to test takers, that there was experimental content in a real section. And they haven't, and I trust that they would actually let people know that, just because of how important it is. There's no way they're doing this, and they can't do it for some people and for others. So as soon as we can separate out the wig passage into one RC and Rakim into another RC, it's going to be separate for every single person. And I have found virtually no variance from that. And the few occasions where somebody's like adamant, no, I had this and that, in every case where we could prove it afterwards, they were proved wrong. So they don't mix and match content. What's happening instead is that the pressure of the test, the stress of the experience, is affecting your memory. It is, you're thinking, well, I know for sure I had those two. You didn't. It just feels that way because everything has been changed by the pressure and anxiety of going through the actual test. I once had a student, we were talking about logic games, and he had an experimental game section and a real game section, and he was insistent that a game that I knew was real had not appeared in his real section, and wrote down extensive notes about it in an effort to prove me wrong. And I said, well, the nice thing is this was a disclosed test several years ago. Day the test came out, it turned out that indeed he'd gotten it mixed up, and he was like, I think he was crestfallen that he was like, I'm going to prove you wrong. And I'm like, okay, we should put some money on it. But I didn't. But he was very upset with himself. And I was like, don't be upset. This is what happens. This is an experience that nobody enjoys. You're not focused on what game is in what section. You're focused on doing well. Don't think about that stuff. You don't need to worry about it. Just focus on the question that you're actually doing. And that's why when we get these questions, and I got a bunch of them this time for some reason, I know you got a bunch as well. We try to be very gentle about it and be like, yes, that's just something where you're confusing it. We know that at this point that you're confusing it. And we're going to tell you that because obviously we want to be honest about it, but there is zero chance that it's being mixed and matched. And we have reams of information that counter that possibility from occurring.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing up some causes for this potential confusion because, again, we see it every single test. And this one did feel pretty heavy with this suspicions. And that's usually it, just a slightly fuzzy memory, which is completely understandable. keep in mind too, and this is something we talk about a lot, it's easy for the test makers to create this type of confusion. You have to think it's not entirely unintentional on their part. They use similar topics all the time. You see it in LR most of all because there's so many different topics. But I mean, take reading comp this time. In November reading comp, we saw a real passage with Quebec as a theme and an experimental passage with Quebec as the theme. So it's very easy, especially as people go out and then try to engage with other anonymous posters. It's very easy to be like, wait, they said they had a Quebec passage with these other ones. Well, I had Quebec with these. Instant confusion.
Mm-hmm.
So that degree of topical overlap, topical redundancy in many ways, it's just the perfect storm when you add on to it the anxiety of trying to remember this stuff in the first place.
Yeah, it presents a challenge for us sometimes in trying to figure out what might be real or experimental. This is one of the multiple challenges that we face when we're trying to like put together a podcast episode that reviews the tests, because there's always questionable information out there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, I think most cases it's not intentional. It's just blurry memory, that fog after the test that a lot of people are in. And if you're ever a person who finished the LSAT and thought to yourself, boy, that was a blur, well, then you can see how easily this would happen. And especially in what you pointed out, LR. That's
LR.
where we see it more than any other section. Games and reading comprehension, when I see it, it's often really easy to kind of like disprove. With LR, it becomes a little bit harder because it feels so real to the person who went through it. But it's just that kind of stress response. You're not focused on it. Completely understandable.
Yeah, LR for sure. That's where the vagaries seem to present the most danger. And where we have to be, I think this is true for the both of us, where we have to tiptoe and be very judicious but cautious a little bit in what we say in response to the reports that we get.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always very wary, not skeptical, but just cautious. When people start to talk about LR topics, and I'm certain I didn't have that question, but I had these other three, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We've watched some reports come in where we're like, that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
And you try to tease it out, and then what you start to hear is, oh, maybe I am wrong about that, and then slowly the whole thing unravels. So you have to be really careful with it. I guess that's part of the art and magic of us trying to like sift through this. Is sometimes we have to make an assessment of the viability of what we're hearing.
Yeah, we run on instinct a little bit with that. This strange like alchemy of what we know versus maybe what we can piece together.
That's exactly right. And on that note, let's move to the next question, which is about the LSAT writing. Jon, this question was to you, so I will.
It is to me,
defer to
although
you.
we both get a nice compliment at the beginning. It says, "Hi, Jon, parentheses, and Dave, longtime fan of your work. I've taken the LSAT multiple times," which I guess explains the long time part of that. So, taking the LSAT multiple times, I've taken it 4 times, but only did writing samples for the first 2. The 2 most recent takes with no writing sample were in 2019, and the writing samples were from 2018. Am I in trouble? And will my scores still be released to the schools I'm applying to?
I feel like I got this question too.
It wouldn't surprise me if they just switched my name and yours, and I went into parentheses while you started.
I don't think people realize how often we talk and share information. Be like, hey, did you get this message? Yeah, I got that message. All right, I'll let you respond. We do not like to do double work. I can tell you that right now. I've said it before. Send the message to one of us, not both of us. Which has nothing to do with this particular message.
No.
It's just a general disclaimer. If you sent the message to somebody like me, I typically respond, and it may take a day or two in some instances, but you and I are both the same that way.
Yeah.
Send it to both of us. Later on, we get mad.
We're both pretty good about responding, which is part of the problem. That means if we both get a message, we tend to send 2 responses. And given how infrequently we disagree, I promise those 2 responses are going to read more or less copy-paste.
Yeah, they'll be the same. And in this particular case, I'm sure that if we did both respond to it, meaning if we both got it, because we would have responded, I know that we said the same thing. I'll defer again to you.
Well, I can tell you what I said, actually, because I did respond. I said, don't worry, you're all good. LSAT writing is valid for 5 years. So as long as you have a single sample on file that's not more than 5 years prior to your latest test, which in this case, the person has 2 on file, then you do not have to do another one. And I got back an all caps message, best news of the month. So,
now I got to go check my Twitter messages because I feel like your answer is better because it goes into the 5 years thing. I think I said something like, you're in the clear. As long as they have one on record, you're good. So both with the same operational effect. And just keep in mind, for those of you who took the November LSAT. And if you have never done an LSAT writing, you need to do it now. If you want to get your scores back on December 1st, I think you can probably still do it and get it right now, but time is running out, especially with this holiday coming up. That might actually throw a wrench into this. So at least in America, we've got Thanksgiving coming up. I know Canada already had their Thanksgiving.
That's right.
So they're not taking the break that we are, but LSAC will take a break during that period of time. So if you haven't done LSAT writing, go do it now.
Yeah, and we've actually got a really good podcast episode about LSAT writing. So if part of your hesitation may stem from uncertainty as to how to proceed, go find that episode. It'll help you out. It'll give you everything you need.
All right, moving on. We've got a couple questions on my favorite topic from earlier in this podcast, and that is taking, postponing, and canceling.
I like it.
And I think these came into our forum, if I recall correctly. So let's take a look at the very first one. It says, I'm scheduled for the November LSAT, and very recently I was feeling optimistic about my prospects for my target score if I can focus on my studies for the next couple of weeks. All right, that's good. However, things at work have gotten pretty wild, and I don't know if I will have the time I thought I would to study leading up to the LSAT. All right, that's bad. Is it better just to reschedule or take the exam anyway and see how I do, even though I may not be able to study very much in the next few weeks? So I can dive into this one. You can dive into it. What's your preference?
Well, it's a little bit like those double Twitter messages. I'm certain we're going to say the same thing. So you take
The answer is it depends. And I would typically follow up this type of question with like, give me more information about where you're scoring right now, what your target score is, how far away you are. Because if you're pretty close, then I can see an argument being made that says not studying constantly in the next couple of weeks isn't actually going to hurt you. I'm not the biggest fan of just like going crazy in the last 2 or 3 weeks before a test. I feel it wears you out. It creates a lot of undue stress. And I've told many people in past webinars and on this podcast, if you're feeling burned out, take a break. I don't care if the LSAT is in 2 weeks, take 3 or 4 days off. Your mental health and self-care routine is more important than doing, another 100 questions. So if this person was like, I'm pretty close, and they say that they've been doing well, feeling optimistic, how close are you? Or is it 8 points away? Because that's one thing. Are you 3 points away? That's different. With 3 points, I'd probably be like, yeah, go in and give it a shot. You're close enough. Maybe kind of like coasting into it is the best possible thing that you can do.
Yeah. I like that you phrase it that way because that's really what you want. I mean, this person mentions a time frame of the final 2 weeks. I always see that as a place where you really want to coast to the finish line. You don't want to have to go and like do that runner's kick for the final lap. Yeah. This is meant to be something where you've already really peaked in terms of maximal effort. And now with the final couple of weeks, you're focused on refinement. You're focused a lot on mentality and attitude. That's really what the final few weeks tend to be more about. So, yeah, this is all about proximity to goals.
Yeah, now if you're looking at it and you're like, look, I'm nowhere near my score and I'm not going to be able to study at all. Okay, that's the decision point where you're like, all right, let me push it. You have to, each person is going to have their own response to this. So it's not as if we can give a blanket answer. We can give a branch decision tree here, which I think we've kind of done based upon proximity to score, but there is not an ironclad answer for every single person that's the same.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to even put a number to it in terms of like if you're this far away, postpone or withdraw. If you're this close, take it. But I would say if you're not really going to be able to do much, if any, prep in the final 2 weeks, and you've still got at least 5 or 6 points or more to go, it's fairly unrealistic, I think, or maybe overly optimistic to imagine that you're going to get in there on test day and somehow discover those 6 points. That is very unlikely.
People don't get lucky like that typically. They get unlucky a lot more, it seems like, than they get lucky on this test.
That is sad but true, isn't it?
Yeah, that's because there's 80% wrong answer choices that you're looking at in every problem. So your chances of failure are much higher, as we all know, which is not a criticism of anybody. It's just that, look, when you're guessing and you're uncertain, you're more likely to end up with a wrong answer choice than the correct answer because only one of the 5 is correct.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a minefield where 80% of the field is mines. That's a terrible thing to walk through, especially.
It's a harsh visual, man.
Good luck.
Lots of explosions. I don't like the sound of it.
Yeah.
Let's go to part 2 of this question, which is in that same vicinity. If I take the test and I get below my target score, if I have LSAT preview or score preview, should I cancel? And I want to address this on both sides. I want to address the score preview, and then I want to address what happens when someone just takes another test and they end up with a lower score. Because I think both sides of this are worthy. So let's talk about somebody who's been scoring 165 on average. They go out and they have scored a 155 on their test. They have score preview. What should they do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we're coming back to the idea of cancellations. We touched on it, but it certainly deserves more attention than we've given it so far. So here we are. It's interesting. You know, I've never seen much value, and you alluded to this before, I think quite well. I've never seen much value in putting a score on your record that either is non-representative, unrepresentative of you and what you know you're capable of based on practice tests, or putting a score on your record that you know isn't going to help you, isn't going to serve to get you into the types of schools that you are determined to go to. It's not just a meaningless result at that point. It's one of those things that I think it lives there like an anchor behind you the whole time you're dragging it for 5 years. And every time you glance behind you, you have this reminder of when things didn't go the way you hoped.
Mm-hmm.
Schools may not necessarily care, but I promise you will. So be done with it. Wipe that slate clean if you can. And that, to me, I think is one of the big values in a cancel, is that it lets you dismiss it.
Yeah, human mentality is a tough thing because people tell themselves one thing all the time. Oh, I'll just ignore it. It won't be that big of a deal. I'll be fine with whatever I get. And then it actually shows up. And I've seen many students then have a visceral reaction where they start saying, I am that score. First off, nobody's the score they get. It doesn't really matter. It's just a score on a test that once you get through this process will not have further bearing on your life. So if you get a score that you're not happy with, it doesn't mean anything about you as a person. You're significantly more, far, far more than your LSAT score. But at the same time, for the average person, if they have underperformed and they know it, it eats at them.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there are a few people out there who can kind of dismiss it and it's not that big of a deal. But a lot of people I know, it bothers them. And that's what they end up leading with. Well, I got a 150 on my first test and it was well below what I expected. But I'm like, if you had known that you were getting that score and had the ability to wipe it away, that can be such a relief because you're like, all right, that was my one out here. I took it. That was smart. Now I'm going to come back and show that I am the person I've been practice testing. I am a 160 or a 165 or whatever you may be testing at. So I'm a huge fan of using it in that type of situation. If you look at cancellations in general, there is, common kind of like public knowledge on this is, hey, law schools take the highest score. That's all that matters. And I'm a true believer in that too. Law schools have told me many times, look, if you've gotten a 170 and then you go get a 166 on the next test, you're still a 170 to us. You got a 170. That's the score that we report to the American Bar Association. That's the score that's used for U.S. News and World Report rankings. So we don't have to worry about your 166. Mm-hmm. Psychologically, though, for a lot of test takers, if they score a 170 and they're like, I'm going to try to get a few extra points, and then they go down, it's devastating. Because they're like, I know I'm better than that. Now they start questioning themselves. And I think that when I talk to students these days, I've kind of tempered my advice. There are some people who do this who are like, never cancel. And I understand why they say that. I just don't agree with it 100%. Usually what I try to do is I say, where have you been scoring? And then how did this test go from an assessment standpoint? And that means you need to self-assess with a fairly reasonable degree of accuracy. But I had a ton of students who were like, look, I was scoring in the 170s. There's no way I got to that. I'd be happy, I'd be lucky if I got a 165. And I'm like, why are you thinking about keeping this? You didn't get lucky on this situation for reasons we just talked about. It's almost astronomically against you that you did. Why put this on the record when you're telling me right now it'll drive you crazy? Sometimes it's hard, though. I talked to a student on Reddit, actually, who was asking me about this. And I said, give me a realistic best case, worst case scenario. And they were like, well, I could have missed 10 or I could have missed 30. And I had to be blunt. I didn't mean to be harsh if I was. So if you're out there listening, apologies. But I was like, I'm got to be honest, that's not helpful here.
Yeah.
10 to 30 misses is not you assessing yourself, it's guessing. And I can't work with guessing. I need to work with like a good self-evaluation.
Yeah, what I tend to do in cases like that, and that's an extreme case.
It's a true story.
I believe it. But what I tend to do is like, let's break it down bit by bit. How'd you feel about the first game? Did you guess? Did you finish in time? Like, go smaller, and then slowly you can sum up what is a much more likely outcome in terms of a scoring range prediction. But the way I tend to look at this too is, why would you ever put something on your record that you'd prefer people not to see? Why would you ever quantify a performance that you don't feel is as good as it could have been, or that might somehow come with judgment? Some things do come with judgment, and they're better kept secrets, like my missed flight record. Probably shouldn't have gotten into that. This is how we'd erase the tape. But
we could edit this.
Yeah, I know. This is one of those where I feel really the same way about it. Why show schools anything about yourself that you're not proud to show?
Yeah, and now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying cancel if you feel just a little bit of badness about it. I'm talking about in situations where you know internally, this just wasn't at my level. Things went wrong, I had technological problems. I'm talking about a situation where you have a high degree of confidence in your own assessment that it just wasn't the right day for you. If you are looking at your situation and you're saying, hey, I think I might have gotten close, it's really hard to tell, keep it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what this whole policy is for, and is benefiting people of being able to take that highest score. If there is a legitimate chance that you scored higher than whatever you have on record, I'm all for keeping it. I'm just not going to tell people who are almost like telling me, look, I might have scored 10, 15 points lower. I'm not going to tell them to keep that score because I've seen the negative effects on people who have done that in the past. I'm not worried about the law school. I'm worried about the test taker.
Yeah.
Which, by the way,
go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, this brings to one more thing. This is something that I just want to reiterate. It's a blog post that I wrote years ago, and I can't even remember the name of it. But what I was telling people to do in this post was every time you take a practice test, assess your performance. Do a best case, worst case scenario for each section, and then predict your score. Do that over and over every single time. Why? Because when you get to the real test, you're going to be really happy that you know whether or not your intuition is anywhere close to accurate or whether it's just completely terrible. That way you can say, look, I've been wrong repeatedly about my self-assessment. Okay, good. That's good information for someone like me. And other times you've got people who are like, look, I'm always within a couple points of my predictions and I don't feel good about this. Or you feel great about it.
Right.
So that is something I advise students to do every single test that they take. Self-assess, best case, worst case, overall score, possible range, and then go check your results and say, what happened? It's kind of its own little mini casino. I make it into a game with students I've worked with in the past, but it's amazingly helpful when the real test comes down and it's not your first time self-assessing like this, it's your 30th time doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I tell students that constantly too. Treat every test like the real thing, including how you look back on it, what you think about it in self-assessment, post-exam. The final point that I'll make to this, because this is a factor in it as well, is the timing and the cycle of the test itself can matter. I'm much more inclined to tell somebody to cancel a shaky June or July performance if they still have that entire fall to retest and apply than I would be telling that to somebody in February where they're starting to push up against hard deadlines or maybe only one more attempt. This can matter too. You can roll the dice a little more deeper into the cycle because, frankly, you need to take some chances then, unless you just have a year you don't mind waiting.
Which I think is a good summary point. Anybody who tells you there's a flat answer, yes or no, to the cancel question, no. People aren't that one-dimensional. There's multiple dimensions here. There's multiple factors that are in play. You got to self-assess based upon all those things, then make that final decision. Let's move on.
Perfect. Only a couple more, which is a shame. I want to stretch this because I know it's going to be a while before we get a chance to do it again.
Oh, no, I'm doing a bunch while you're gone.
Sweet. Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
If you cross 100 without me, though, I'm going to be pissed.
That doesn't give me much room. This is episode 98.
No.
I should have some guests, on while you're gone just to irritate you.
A centennial episode with me. unavailable.
You wouldn't even listen. You'd be like, man, I'm in Spain. I don't care what you're doing. All right, let's go to the second to last question. I'll go ahead and read this one. It came in off our forum. It's about whether you should retake the test or settle with the score that you have. And this question says, I just received my score for the October 2021 LSAT, which was a 162. I've been very consistently scoring in the upper 160s, low 170s on my prep test for a few months now, so the 162 was very disappointing. Now, if you've been listening to what I've been saying for the last few minutes, you might already know what my version of the answer to this would be. I'm retaking the November LSAT, but can only expect to jump a few points at the most, which I totally disagree with, but that's just stream of consciousness. I would think, since it's 2.5 weeks away, so this came in a little bit earlier. Is it worth it to take it again in January, but be really late in the application cycle? So there's two things there. First off, the comment about, hey, I got the 162 and I've been practice testing in the upper 160s to low 170s. That 162 is disappointing, and I'm about to take November, which is now passed, but I can only expect to jump a few points. I'm just going to dismiss that right here. Why? Your practice tests tell me that you could score in the 170s. You've done it. Why can you only jump a few points from 162? That's ridiculously limiting to think that way. Mm-hmm. So I'm irritated by that form of the question in a good way, though, because I'm like happy for that person. I'm like, hey, if we can recalibrate your thinking on this and change your perspective, you won't go in thinking that I can only jump a few points, because you're self-limiting at that point. You're not believing in your own proven results in practice tests. To me, you've gotten 170s on practice tests. You're still a possible 170 on the real thing.
For sure.
You agree?
I completely agree, and I think 2.5 weeks, this person should give that time frame more credit. It's amazing what you can do in 18, 20 days. You can make some huge gains in a very short period of time because of what the nature of the test is. It's not testing how much you've memorized, how much you've studied, your experience and exposure. It's just testing how you think. And you can make profound adjustments to that, frankly, in an afternoon if you get the right kind of advisement.
Yeah, I don't actually perceive this at this point as an LSAT problem, but a test mentality problem.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
It's this person doesn't believe in themselves, even though they've proven repeatedly they have the capacity to score better. And I don't care if it's the upper 170s and the lower 160s. You could be practice testing in the 150s, go out and get a 140. You still have the ability to score in the 150s. It's all about what you do versus where you're practicing. But your practice testing is on real LSATs. As long as you're not deceiving yourself or doing it with like unlimited time, I don't see any reason to think that there's this limitation. All right, now let's just say that they went out and they either didn't finish January or November rather, or their score was still rather the same. Now let's go to the second part of this question. Is it worth it to take it again in January, which would then put this person later in the application cycle?
Yeah, I think the way they phrase it is, but then be really late in the application cycle, which is another part of this question I take some issue with, frankly. I should note, too, this came in on our forum before the November test, and we answered it there. I just thought it was such a useful question. I wanted to make it a part of this conversation, too.
Yeah, because this deals with the January test, and both this question and our last question revolve around that. Let's go ahead and address the part that you said about the cycle. Mm-hmm. January is actually the middle of the cycle for a lot of law schools. For the T14, it's not. It's moving towards the latter end of the main T14 applications. But for many schools that are out there, this January is still right in the middle, and it is certainly not at all late for them. If you are applying to the T14, this does push you back later. But I'll say this much, it doesn't really matter when you apply. If you don't have the LSAT score to get into a T14, you're not, especially this year. Mm-hmm. Last year proved that over and over again, because people who had T14 LSAT scores didn't get into T14s because the bubble was so brutal, and we still have somewhat of a bubble. So that whole thing about, what to do, if 162 is not going to do it for the schools you're looking at, I would say take the January test and not worry about being later in the cycle, because you're not getting in unless you have that higher score.
Yeah, between your LSAT score and the timing of your test date, only one of those two can really disqualify you, and it is not the test date.
I like that. And the way I often phrase it is, guess what? When law schools go to report all their data to the ABA, which then gets used by US News, what they don't report is the day you applied. What they do report, your LSAT score. So
Exactly.
which one do you think is way, way more important?
Yeah. So to the first bit about November, no reason to think you couldn't improve. But if you don't, and then look at January, you're not late in the application cycle, at least not in a really late, punitive way. And if you can improve, it is almost certainly worth a retake, no matter when in the cycle, if you can get even a few more points. I would take 3 extra points in January over November, even though it means a 2-month wait.
There's zero question that would, in almost all cases, end up being beneficial.
And a person like this who's PTing maybe 10 points above their actual score that they got in October, I mean, all signs point to try again.
Well, these are two totally different, outcomes.
Mhm.
Let's say 162 versus 170. The schools that you're getting into with those two scores and a relatively competitive GPA are very different here. They are just not going to be the same. And of course, that means a whole host of other kind of like after effects, different job opportunities, different initial starting salaries, and so forth. Plus, that higher LSAT score typically translates into greater kind of like financial aid packages. This is why you see people who have really high LSAT scores and who know they're going to have a pretty good cycle end up taking some of these later LSATs like March or April, because they're going to then use the results of one of those later tests, not to get into schools, but to hopefully increase their leverage when it comes to negotiating.
Mhm.
They're out there, they're like, well, I was a 174 before, but I went and I took the March LSAT and I'm a 177 now. Show me the money.
Yeah.
That's really how it works. We call it negotiation, but the law schools call it reconsideration. And when you ask for reconsideration, there's a couple different reasons that you might throw out there, like, hey, I've got an offer over here that's really good that I think is competitive and better. Can you match it or can you come up with it? Or something material has changed in my application. Well, the LSAT score is the easiest material thing to change.
Yeah. I mean, we say this all the time, but it does bear repeating, I think. This whole process is an investment, arguably the best investment you can make in your entire life when it comes not just to where you go to school and the prestige and the opportunity that affords, but as you mentioned, salaries and most immediately, money, financial aid. You can begin to quantify every LSAT point with a dollar sign on it, because that is ultimately how this translates when you get into reconsideration mode or first consideration mode with schools.
Mhm.
Be so desirable that they'll do anything to have you attend. They'll throw money at you. That's what a retake can provide.
Yeah, there's been a general drumbeat in some quarters this year about like you got to apply in the first 2 weeks. And I understand that because earlier application, you get looked at earlier and so forth. But this is already a slower cycle than we've seen in recent years. So already just the general structural situation is not the way it was in prior years. And you have to take that into account. If you can raise your score, it's in almost all cases worth it. It's very rare that it would not be. So on that note, let's go to the very last question.
Let's do it.
Which talks about January as well. And this student was asking, what happens when I enroll for the January LSAT in terms of the schools I'm either applying to or already have my application? What's going to occur with them? Will they make a decision before my January score comes out? So, first off, this is typically what happens at law schools. When you sign up for that January LSAT, let's say you've already applied at a school, what happens is they get a report that comes to them regularly from LSAC. And that report says, hey, student X is taking the January LSAT. At most schools, what they do at that point is they're like, let's see how that goes. And they just put you on ice. They just say, let's wait and see. Now, if you're really worried, like you want them to consider that January test, you can actually send them a message and say, hey, just so you know, I signed up for January. I would appreciate it if you hold my application until then. Most schools will honor that because that's what they were going to do anyway. Sometimes I've seen students who say, hey, I really want you to go ahead and just consider me now and don't worry about the January test. Schools will often ignore that request. And the reason is because they don't want to go through their process, make a decision while you've got a 162, give you an offer admission, and then you go out in January and get a 172. And now all of a sudden you're like, haha, I don't care. All the schools that I was uncertain about have decided to accept me. Schools have a very kind of like monetary, results-oriented view towards all of this. So you might say, please consider me. They don't have to. They might say, oh, sure, we'll do that. And then they just don't. They don't want to be left high and dry, and yield protection is a real thing. And when you're taking another LSAT, that's what they're concerned about. So you will get put on hold for the most part. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. The report comes in, they just cross-reference it, and they're like, oh, new LSAT coming. If you're, sitting in a score that's lower, no big deal to them. They're like, well, maybe you'll score better and you'll become more competitive and we'll be happier. But they're not saying, you got to go up 5 points for us to consider you. They're not considering you at that point.
Yeah, I was going to point to the flip side of that coin, which is they also don't want to say no to someone who a month later might be qualified.
Good point.
And that is what a potential but unrealized test date says to them. I mean, that is the exact sign that they see it as. I don't want to make a judgment about someone who is, in theory, going to be different a month away, 2 months away.
Yeah. Taking the LSAT again can change your position significantly. The school doesn't want to be left out in the cold on that, so they're going to wait and see what the story is.
Exactly. It's a little bit like score preview. They really want to preview your score too before they have to make some decision. Yeah. Hopefully, not cancel, but right.
That's actually a great question that I started to see cropping up, around the recent LSATs. Can schools see your score before you do?
Oh, I get that too.
The answer is no.
No.
They cannot. Now, the day your score posts to your account, it will start posting to schools, and some of them have automatic emails that they start sending out the day before that's like, oh, congratulations on your new score. Please apply here or what have you. Those are just automated marketing emails. They cannot, I guarantee, see your score before you do. If you can imagine the legal implications of that, just, for a second, everyone would realize, oh yeah, this is a ridiculous idea. It's a natural question based upon some of the things that you see, but you see your score first. The schools see it very soon thereafter, though.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, there will be a flood of confusion come November 30th. The day before score release, where you'll start to see some emails from schools floating around. They don't know your numbers any more than you do, but the next day there's going to be some eyeballs all over it. So prepare yourself for that.
That's exactly right. So kind of like a second part of this January LSAT question is, well, what if I'm thinking of applying right now, but I'm going to take the January LSAT? Should I? Doesn't make a difference.
Yeah,
is the answer. And here's why. You might think to yourself, well, I went ahead and I applied kind of like, in the third week of November, so that's my kind of slot of consideration. No. Your slot of consideration doesn't really start until all pieces of your application are finalized. And that's going to include that January LSAT that they're waiting for. So they will just put you on hold and wait. And that's completely normal for them. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, I need to apply right now to kind of hold my space, there's no space to be held. Instead, the better thing to do is to say, I'm going to apply the moment I feel like the rest of my application is top notch and cannot be improved, that I've proofed it 25 times, which is really what people should be doing, and gone through everything and made sure that I love every single word, even the and the ors that I've used in my personal statement. So you can go ahead and wait. It does you no good to hurry up and submit an application that's incomplete for whatever reason. Wait until it's ready to go. Now, am I going to wait until my score comes out in January? No. I'm actually going to make sure I've applied at least earlier than that so that when my score does show up, it is ready that very moment. But that's exactly how I would do it if I was in that position right now.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Let the score that's coming be the final piece of the puzzle. Let that be when the hammer drops. And then schools can evaluate your final application and see who you truly are.
Awesome. Well, that's the last question. John, got anything else to add?
No. I wish you'd come down here and pack for me, but that's probably far-fetched.
No, I don't like packing in general, so I usually try to
either.
get it out of the way.
Oh, I don't like it, so I usually leave it to the very last minute. Like pack in the Uber on the way to the airport.
You're going all over the place, so you should probably make sure you get it together.
You're just telling me this now? All right.
12 hours before you leave.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you have a great trip. Be safe out there.
Thank you, brother. It'll be a good time. I'll
I
bring
am
you
sure
back.
that it will.
I'll bring you back a rug or something.
Nice, man. I'll take whatever. Bring me back some port, dude. That's what I'd like more than anything.
Yeah, that's on the list to see what they'll ship. Assuming they'll ship, I'll definitely send you some bottles.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I would certainly take that. And in the meantime, I will hold down the fort here.
I appreciate that more than you know. So thank you.
All right. Well, on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and give us a rating as well. And if you have any questions that generate out of this podcast, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of myself and the world-traveling Jon Denning, we hope you've enjoyed it. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.